For more than 160 million years, the Earth belonged to the dinosaurs. They had witnessed continents drift apart, mountains rise, and oceans reshape the face of the planet. They survived changing climates, evolved into thousands of extraordinary species, and spread across nearly every environment on Earth. To any observer, their reign would have seemed eternal. 66 million years ago, nothing suggested that this age was about to end. The morning began as countless mornings had before it. Soft sunlight filtered through towering conifer forests. Moist air drifted above rivers that wound across broad floodplains before emptying into warm inland seas. Ferns carpeted the ground beneath ancient trees, while flowering plants added new colors to landscapes that had once belonged almost entirely to conifers. The world was alive. Dragonflies skimmed across quiet ponds. Small mammals slipped cautiously between roots and fallen branches, searching for seeds and insects before larger predators became active. Turtles rested along muddy riverbanks, and crocodilians floated almost motionless beneath the surface, waiting patiently for an opportunity that might come hours later. Across the open plains, herds of triceratops grazed peacefully, their powerful beaks stripping tough vegetation as younger animals remained safely within the protection of the herd. Nearby, heavily armored, ankylosaurs moved slowly through patches of low shrubs, their club-like tails dragging gentle marks across the damp ground far above them. Giant pterosaurs circled on, rising columns of warm air barely moving their wings. From this height the forests seemed endless, stretching far beyond the horizon in every direction. Somewhere among those forests walked the largest predator of its time. A Tyrannosaurus rex followed familiar game trails with slow, deliberate steps. Every movement reflected millions of years of evolution. There was no urgency, no sign of danger. It was simply another morning in a world that had remained remarkably stable for countless generations. The Earth itself appeared calm. Volcanoes smoked on distant horizons as they often had. Rivers carried sediment toward ancient seas. Seasons continued their slow rhythm, and life followed patterns that had repeated for millions of years. Nothing in the forests, nothing in the oceans, and nothing in the skies hinted that this ordinary day would become one of the most important days in the history of life, because far beyond the blue sky, still invisible to every living creature below, something was already on its way. Far beyond the Earth's atmosphere, where there was only silence and darkness, an ancient traveler continued a journey that had begun millions of years earlier. It was an asteroid, a massive fragment of rock left behind from the formation of the solar system more than 4.5 billion years ago. For countless ages, it had circled the sun, following an orbit that crossed the paths of planets without purpose or intention. Tiny gravitational influences slowly altered that orbit over immense spans of time. None of these changes mattered on a human timescale, but over millions of years, they were enough to place the asteroid on a collision course with the Earth. It measured roughly 10 to 15 kilometers across, making it larger than Mount Everest is tall. Traveling at nearly 20 kilometers per second, it carried more energy than humanity has ever released through all of its weapons combined. The Earth continued its peaceful rotation beneath it. Cloud systems drifted across warm oceans. Rain fell over distant forests, Rivers carved their way through ancient floodplains, and every living creature continued its ordinary routine, completely unaware that a chain of events already set in motion long before their species existed was about to reach its conclusion. As the asteroid drew closer, Earth's gravity pulled it faster and faster. Within minutes, the blue planet filled its view. The atmosphere, so thin when seen from space, was the only barrier separating life below from the immense energy racing toward it. Then, in a matter of seconds, the asteroid reached the upper atmosphere. The air in front of it could not move away quickly enough. Instead, it was compressed with such violence that its temperature rose to several thousand degrees. A brilliant envelope of superheated plasma surrounded the asteroid, making it shine brighter than anything in the daytime sky. Unlike the small meteors that burn away high above the Earth, this object was far too large to be stopped. It never slowed enough to matter. It continued its descent almost untouched, crossing the atmosphere in only a few seconds as it raced toward a shallow tropical sea near what is now the Yucatan Peninsula. Below, the forests remained peaceful. No dinosaur looked upward. No bird abandoned its nest. No animal fled. The last ordinary morning of the age of dinosaurs was only moments away from becoming the last morning at all. The impact came with a force beyond imagination. In less than a single second, an asteroid nearly 10 to 15 kilometers across slammed into the shallow sea near what is now the Yucatan Peninsula at almost 20 kilometers per second. The collision released an amount of energy that is estimated to have exceeded billions of Hiroshima-sized atomic bombs. No volcanic eruption, earthquake, or storm in recorded human history comes close to its scale. For an instant, the surface of the Earth behaved almost like a liquid. The asteroid did not simply strike the ground. It penetrated deep into the crust, excavating an enormous crater nearly 200 kilometers across. Limestone, granite, seawater, and everything else at the impact site were instantly compressed, melted, and vaporized. Temperatures at the center of the collision reached several thousands of degrees Celsius. Nothing within hundreds of kilometers survived. An immense fireball expanded outward at incredible speed, while a shock wave tore across the surrounding landscape. Forests closest to the impact vanished almost instantly. Every plant, every animal, and every drop of water near the collision became part of a rapidly expanding cloud of vaporized rock. At the same time, trillions of tons of debris were blasted high above the atmosphere. Some fragments escaped the Earth's gravity entirely. Others climbed hundreds of kilometers into the sky before beginning their long descent back toward the planet. The impact also triggered earthquakes, unlike anything modern civilization has ever experienced. The ground shook across entire continents, while the ancient oceans transmitted powerful seismic waves through the Earth's crust. Near the impact site, the seafloor collapsed before rebounding upward with enormous force. The surrounding ocean rushed back toward the newly formed crater, beginning a chain of gigantic tsunamis that would soon spread across the world's coastlines. Yet, even as these devastating events unfolded, they marked only the beginning of the catastrophe. The collision itself lasted only a few moments. Its consequences would transform life on Earth for years, and the planet would never be the same again. As the first hours passed, The disaster spread far beyond the impact site. The enormous cavity left by the collision collapsed almost as quickly as it had formed. Millions of cubic meters of seawater rushed back toward the crater before being forced upward once again, generating colossal tsunamis that raced across the ancient oceans. Some waves may have reached heights of hundreds of meters near the source, before gradually losing energy as they crossed entire ocean basins. When they reached distant coastlines, they tore through river valleys, flooded coastal plains, and carried enormous amounts of sand, mud, and broken vegetation far inland. But the oceans were only one part of the catastrophe. High above the atmosphere, the debris ejected by the impact had reached the highest point of its flight. Gravity soon began pulling it back. Over the following hours, countless fragments of molten and shattered rock re-entered the atmosphere at extraordinary speeds. The sky glowed with thousands upon thousands of incandescent streaks, as if the entire heavens had become a continuous meteor shower. This returning material heated the atmosphere on a global scale. For many regions, the danger did not come from the rocks striking the ground, but from the intense thermal radiation produced as they passed through the air. Dry vegetation ignited over vast areas. Forests, grasslands, and shrubs erupted into enormous wildfires that spread with the wind, filling the atmosphere with smoke and ash. Animals fled instinctively. Some ran toward rivers. Others disappeared into burrows, caves, or beneath fallen trees. Many had survived predators their entire lives, but nothing in their evolutionary history had prepared them for a disaster that engulfed an entire planet. By evening, the world no longer resembled the one that had greeted the sunrise. The air was thick with smoke. The horizon glowed with distant fires. Ash drifted slowly back to the ground, and although the asteroid had struck only once, its effects were now unfolding everywhere. The age of dinosaurs was ending, not in a single moment, but through a chain of events that continued to grow more destructive with every passing hour. When the fires finally began to weaken, a new and even more dangerous phase of the catastrophe had already begun. The sky grew darker with each passing day. The impact had blasted enormous quantities of dust, pulverized rock, soot from global wildfires, and sulfur-rich gases high into the atmosphere. Unlike ordinary storm clouds, these particles remained suspended for months, reflecting and blocking much of the sunlight that normally reached the Earth's surface. Across the planet, daylight faded into an eerie twilight. Temperatures dropped as less solar energy reached the ground. Days became colder, nights even more severe. In many places, seasonal patterns that had remained stable for millions of years disappeared almost overnight. For plants, the consequences were devastating. Without sufficient sunlight, photosynthesis slowed dramatically. New leaves failed to grow. Flowering plants stopped producing seeds. Forests that had survived the fires now began to die in silence. Deprived of the energy that sustained all life on land, the oceans were changing as well. Near the surface, microscopic plankton depended on sunlight just as forests did. As these tiny organisms declined, the foundation of marine food webs began to collapse. Fish populations decreased, marine reptiles struggled to find prey, and the effects spread from the smallest organisms to the largest predators. On land, herbivorous dinosaurs faced an impossible challenge. Every day there was less vegetation to eat. Herds wandered greater distances in search of fresh growth, but the landscapes that had once provided endless food were becoming barren. Weak individuals fell behind, and even the strongest animals found fewer resources with each passing week. The great predators survived a little longer. At first, they fed on animals that had already died from injury, starvation, or exhaustion. But as prey became increasingly scarce, even the most powerful hunters could no longer find enough food to survive. The greatest danger was no longer the impact itself. It was the collapse of the living world. For millions of years, every ecosystem on Earth had depended on sunlight. Now, that foundation had begun to disappear. As weeks became months and months became years, the world entered one of the darkest chapters in the history of life. The impact itself had lasted only seconds. The extinction that followed unfolded slowly. One by one, ecosystems that had taken millions of years to develop began to collapse. Plants disappeared first, followed by the herbivores that depended on them. Then came the predators, whose survival had always depended on healthy populations of prey. The largest animals suffered the most. A fully grown Tyrannosaurus rex required enormous amounts of food simply to stay alive. Triceratops herds could no longer find enough vegetation to sustain their massive bodies. Ankylosaurs, duck-billed dinosaurs, and countless other species faced the same challenge. Size, once one of their greatest advantages, had become a burden. Animals that needed vast territories and abundant food found themselves living in a world that could no longer support them. The oceans experienced a similar collapse. Mosasaurs, the giant marine reptiles that had dominated the seas, disappeared. Ammonites, survivors of several previous mass extinctions over hundreds of millions of years, finally reached the end of their remarkable evolutionary history. Yet extinction did not strike every species equally. Smaller animals often needed far less food. Some survived by feeding on seeds that had remained buried in the soil. Others ate insects, fungi, or decaying organic matter. Many could shelter underground, where temperatures were more stable and conditions less extreme. Survival was no longer determined by strength. It depended on flexibility. By the time sunlight gradually returned and vegetation slowly began to recover, the world had already changed forever. Nearly 3/4 of all species had disappeared. The age of giant dinosaurs had come to an end, leaving behind only a single surviving branch of their ancient family tree. But life has always possessed a remarkable ability to endure. Even as entire groups of animals disappeared, countless other species quietly survived, carrying the future of life through one of the greatest crises our planet has ever experienced. Small mammals were among them. For millions of years, they had lived in the shadow of the dinosaurs. Most were no larger than modern rodents. They spent much of their lives hidden underground or beneath dense vegetation, emerging mainly to search for insects, seeds, fruits, and other small sources of food. Those same habits now became an advantage. Burrows offered protection from extreme temperatures and falling debris. Their modest size meant they required far less food than the giant reptiles that had ruled the earth for so long. While survival remained incredibly difficult, many small mammals managed to endure the long months of darkness. Freshwater ecosystems also proved surprisingly resilient. Rivers, lakes, and wetlands continued to support turtles, crocodilians, amphibians, and many species of fish. Although these environments were affected by the global catastrophe, they often remained more stable than ecosystems on land or in the open ocean. Among the dinosaurs themselves, one extraordinary lineage survived. Small feathered dinosaurs, the ancestors of today's birds, passed through the extinction, while all other known non-avian dinosaurs disappeared. Their relatively small bodies, varied diets, and ability to exploit different habitats likely increased their chances of survival. Insects also continued their ancient work. They broke down fallen plants and animals, recycled nutrients, and helped prepare damaged ecosystems for recovery long before forests returned to their former abundance. Recovery was slow, beyond imagination. It took thousands of years before forests spread widely once again, and millions of years before Earth's ecosystems regained much of their former diversity. The world that emerged was no longer the world of the dinosaurs. It was the beginning of an entirely new age, one in which small survivors would eventually become the dominant forms of life on land. The asteroid that struck the Earth 66 million years ago did far more than bring the age of dinosaurs to an end. It changed the course of life's history forever. Had that single collision never happened, the world around us might be impossible to recognize. The forests, the animals, and perhaps even humanity itself could have followed a completely different path. Instead, life began again. Slowly, the skies cleared. Sunlight returned to the forests. Young plants pushed through soil that had once been covered by ash, and rivers once again carried life across the continents. Nature did not recover in years or even centuries. It recovered over millions of years, one generation at a time. The giant dinosaurs never returned, but their story did not end completely. Every bird that takes flight today is a living reminder that one branch of the dinosaur family survived. Although the great Tyrannosaurus, Triceratops, and countless other species disappeared forever, their distant relatives still fill our skies every single day. Today, the Chicxulub crater lies hidden beneath the Yucatan Peninsula. From above, the forests reveal almost nothing of the unimaginable event buried beneath them. Yet below the surface rests the scar left by the day that forever changed the history of our planet. If someone had walked through those ancient forests on the morning before the impact, they would have seen nothing unusual. Dinosaurs grazed peacefully. Predators followed familiar trails. Birds sang among the trees. Rivers flowed exactly as they had the day before. It looked like just another ordinary morning. And perhaps that is the most extraordinary part of this story. The greatest turning point in the history of life did not begin with a warning. It began on what seemed to be an ordinary day. Thank you for joining me on this journey through Earth's distant past. Until next time, keep exploring the incredible history of our planet.